Good afternoon, everyone, or whatever time you happen to be watching this presentation. I wanted to welcome you all to the third talk in our series during fall 2021, titled Olmsted's Brain, Discovering Health in Urban Places and Wild Spaces. I'm really delighted to bring this series to the public this fall in advance of the 200th anniversary of the birth of Frederick Law Olmsted in 2022. And I'd like to thank the Olmsted 200 and Trinity College and the Trinity College Interdisciplinary Studies for supporting this series and helping to share it with others. So the impetus for this series is a realization that the awareness of the health benefits of nature and the critical role of nature in our long-term survival is really experiencing a major global revival. And health is just one ecosystem service of nature. And I would argue that brain health is really one of the most valuable health-based ecosystem services. As a neuroscientist, I'm very partial to brain health. I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Susan Massino. I'm a joint appointment in neuroscience and psychology at Trinity College, and my official title is the Vernon D. Russa Professor of Applied Science, and I take that role very seriously. And this series is presented to the public and to my fall 2021 class called Nature and Brain Health. So today I'm delighted to present the third talk in the series. And I also wanted to let you know that we have two more upcoming talks this fall, one on November 18th and one on December 2nd. The one on November 18th is by Dr. Dennis Liu from the E.O. Wilson Foundation, titled Leave No Species Behind, Saving Nature and Ourselves. And the talk on December 2nd is titled Why We Need More National Parks by Michael Kellett of Restore. So those will be at this same Zoom link, both on Thursdays at 2 p.m. So first, I'd like to invite my student, Dorothy Annika, to introduce our speaker for today. Dorothy?
All right. Thank you, Professor Massino. All right. Hello, everyone. Today we welcome Dr. Linder, Environmental Health PhD candidate, Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Dr. Linder investigates positive associations between exposure to nature and health, physiological, emotional, and behavioral. Her studies in environmental exposure assessment seek to define metrics for capturing nature affinity that underlies the association of time spent in nature and its related health outcomes. Charting how exposure outdoors is mediated by innate, individual affinity or aversion toward nature can help improve our understanding of those response relationships common in exposure assessment. Dr. Linda's research approach is informed by her public policy background as a U.S. Foreign Service officer with postings overseas and in Washington, and state-level government experience at the state of Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection and the city of Houston. She holds master's degrees in foreign policy from Georgetown University and in sustainability and environmental management from the Harvard Extension School, and a BA dual degree in American Studies and Spanish from the University of Notre Dame. Welcome, Dr. Linder, and we are delighted to hear your presentation titled Olmsted's Nature Connection to Human and Planetary Health. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for such a lovely introduction. And to Dr. Massino for putting not only the series together, but for the inspirational work that you do and always forge the path forward in connecting ecology and nature, and obviously to human health and well-being. So I will go to my screen here. Let's get this into presentation mode. Can you see that fine?
Yes, yep, looks great.
Okay, super. All right, I'm very pleased. I'll be presenting to you the vision that Frederick Law Olmsted had for nature, but more importantly, his work in human and planetary health, which I believe is really undiscovered. And I had a number of great realizations putting this together of how forward-looking he was a century and a half later in the realm of public health. So I hope you enjoy this as much as I enjoyed planning it for you. To go through the presentation roadmap, we're going to consider first Frederick Law Olmsted as a public health practitioner. You all know Olmsted as a preeminent landscape architect whose influence on parks and city landscapes of the US was ubiquitous throughout the 1860s through really the 1880s and carried forward by his sons in the Olmsted brothers practice. But Olmsted had another career. It was distinctly different from landscape architecture and vital to the era. And that was as a public health and sanitary official. I'll then walk you through some of the nature, ecological, and planetary health implications, including some of my own research into the nature and human health relationship. I will introduce a research study in nature that we're launching that I would love for you to join, and then think about some of Olmsted's principles as nature as a means of healing our democratic process, broken democratic process, if I could say that. Okay, I'd first like to say you all are students at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. I am myself I'm from a suburb of Hartford, but native New Britain. I'll refer to that later. But Olmsted, as you may know, was a Hartford native son. Not only did he design the campus in which you're residing, but across the street of Washington Street, it's the Institute of Living Psychiatric Hospital with its beautiful grounds and really broke ground, both literally and metaphorically, for new treatment possibilities for the mentally infirm. So Olmsted gradually developed a philosophy of his own known as communitiveness, which explored the role that landscape architecture could play in improving the human condition. And that's very much the focus of my talk today. Echoing the miasma theory, which was very much in circulation at the time, Olmsted argued that great public parks would function as the lungs of the city, green open spaces where city dwellers could breathe clean air. This is really important because really the determinants of disease and disease distribution were being debated in the middle of the 19th century. We had the contagionists that argued that epidemics resulted from direct person-to-person contact that spread into invisible poisons, because germ theory was not yet known at that time, or genetic theory of disease. So in a piece that Olmsted wrote in 1882, called Trees in Streets and in Parks, this was a letter that was written for the National Association for Sanitary and Rural Improvement. He makes the argument for parks as a canvas for disease, not eradication, but treatment, particularly through the breathing of fresh air. So this miasma theory held that putrid organic matter, and don't forget that we didn't have widespread sanitation or public sewage control, that arose from locally generated decomposing waste, defiled the air and making it healthy and noxious. So these miasmas or gases were the source of all diseases, believed by the miasma theory proponents. And under the right atmospheric conditions, it would be this that provoked epidemics. So the solution, obvious to them, was not to quarantine, but rather to clean up the filth. So let's see what he said in terms of parks being the palliative to this problem. Parks are now as much part of the sanitary apparatus of a large town as aqueducts and sewers are. Their management should be as much a matter of sanitary economy and is rigidly subject to sanitary tests. He goes on to say that it's the desire that people should benefit by the sanitary advantage of breathing, even for 1 or 2 hours a week, the air of the parks, so that's reasonable and actually economical in the treatment methods to beguile them or to attract them into doing so by making the parks attractive. So what we think of as the decorative elements of the park, some of the fountains, the arrangements of shade, seating, and other, we think are superlative to what would be just organic nature, were really a way of drawing people in, not just for the purpose of relaxation, but actually for breathing fresh air, only almost in the way of sanitarian functioned in that day for those that were afflicted with tuberculosis. And then finally, this lovely 3-4 page article, this letter, but it was published, is signed Frederick 'K. I thought you'd enjoy that. Following the work that Olmsted and his partner in landscape architecture, Calvert Vaux, had done for Central Park as really the masterminds of the great landscape design of really our first major municipal park, public park that was open for all. Don't forget, where green space existed, it was very much perhaps in private gardens and behind closed doors. So it was not generally enjoyable by the public. So Frederick Law Olmsted was, owing to his organization and leadership of that project, he was invited to become the general secretary of the US Sanitary Commission during the early years of the Civil War. Now, at the time, you did not have anything comparable to considering the health conditions of the soldiers. And during the time, the soldiers, both in the Union and Confederacy side, but particularly they were tracking the Union here, was that more soldiers died of the spread of endemic diseases and contagious diseases than they did actually from battlefield wounds. So it was imperative at that point that a few doctors recognized that we needed to pay attention as well to the health and sanitation conditions from which the soldiers were dying in very large numbers. So for 2 years during the Civil War, Olmsted served as this general secretary of a commission, which is the predecessor to the American Red Cross. So this commission was dedicated to improving the sanitation of the Union Army's military camps and the health of the Union soldiers. Olmsted understood the importance of sanitation and of sanitary engineering, which were essential tenets in his approach to landscape design, and used these tenets before and after the war. During the first Battle of Bull Run on July 1861 in Manassas, this served really as a turning point for the commission that Olmsted was leading. Beyond the military reasons for the defeat and the inexperience they felt afflicted the troops at the time of these new recruits, the Sanitary Commission showed how the soldiers' poor living environment had contributed to the collapse. The US government finally gave Olmsted and his medical colleagues, something in which they had pleaded for many months, access to the camps. So 3 months after the devastating battle at Bull Run, Olmsted released a report, and he showed how excessive fatigue, I'm quoting, heat and want of food and drink led to the demoralization of the troops. Now, such observations may seem far removed from Olmsted's experience as a landscape architect, public landscapes, but Olmsted viewed the field very broadly, and he did not separate the quality of a person's life from the quality of his physical and natural environment. The Sanitary Commission inspected and made recommendations not just about the soldiers' exhaustion level, but also about design issues at the locations of the camps, the provisioning of the drainage and the waste disposal systems, the ventilation of military tents, which had very poor ventilations, and therefore they were just really incubators for contagious disease like tuberculosis, smallpox at that time, diphtheria. But he also encouraged higher standards for personal hygiene, storage and preparation of food, which was often rancid before being fed and infected itself. And he provisioned goods from civil society to support the nutrition and the comfort of the soldiers. Now, this 2-year job, this stint as head of the Sanitary Commission, apparently exhausted not just really the soldiers, but Olmsted himself. And it said that he had only slept 4 hours a night, really across the 2 years. He was so dedicated to this work. So he was relieved of this commission and then went on to return to the projects of landscape design. And in his private profession, he returned with Calvert Vaux, and they embarked on designing the grounds of Hudson River State Hospital. Now, in the years following the Civil War, one can only imagine, doctors treated a flux of mentally impaired veterans, really unstable, who began to return from Civil War, suffering from what now is recognized to be PTSD. They were put in convalescence and often really warehoused because it was not known how to treat the mentally infirm patients. But Olmsted, together with Calvert Vaux, the great partners in Central Park, they were commissioned to design both the grounds and the building landscaping for this Hudson River State Hospital in New York, Poughkeepsie, New York. Their plan included a great lawn for patients to recreate outdoors, because Olmsted knew that landscape, or what sometimes we call greenscape, contributes to a reduction of anxiety through unconscious or indirect recreation, as he labeled these. In fact, this is exactly what he said in the letter I just showed you. He called the two great natural agents of disinfection sunshine and fall foliage. The foliage itself, because it would capture particulate matter and actually would be lowering some airborne spread of disease vectors. So these are both seen, foliage and sunshine, in this patio or this terrace attached to the Hudson River School and the Hudson River State Hospital. And they're both very abundant at the facility. When in the latter part of the last century, many of these state-run hospitals were decommissioned entirely for a different type of treatment of the mentally ill and various different types of mental and addictive illnesses, it was remarked even at that time, natural beauty and humane treatment revolutionized mental health treatment. And even as the treatment of these patients would face uncertain future with the dismantling of these institutional programs. So Olmsted himself, we can say clearly he was a reformer for mental and physical well-being. He went on to design a number of institutions to treat mental illness. And so the landscaping became part and parcel of the palliative care. It was not just simply decorative and ending there, but it was woven into the very treatment of patients who were assigned to these facilities. So we have green space from a scientific perspective mediates the relationship between mental health and other health outcomes, such as anxiety, depression, really chronic disease at that point. So we can see the grounds here of a great, it's called the Free Hospital for Women that he first designed. The McLean Hospital for Psychiatric Residency, which is operated to this day by Mass General Hospital here in Belmont, Mass. And the idea of incorporating healing gardens is something that we have seen spread to institutions for medical care across the United States. This one is part of the Hartford Hospital Cancer Center, and I've selected it due to its proximity to you all on the Trinity campus, but it's located in Plainville, Connecticut. And the Cancer Center treats, it's diagnostic all the way to acute treatment for cancer patients. But as they receive infusions in this upper floor, they're able to look out from their seats onto this healing garden. So the connection between the healing process, the reduction of anxiety during such an anxiety-prone treatment process, people often diagnosed with such horrible cancer diagnoses, is something that has really put the patients at ease. And the staff has remarked as well on how it really helps in the treatment process and receptivity. I'm going to take you to my hometown, my birthplace in New Britain, Connecticut, because this particular mapping and this postcard, well, the map on the left and the postcard in the upper right, this map was, I believe, 1875, if we were to look at this under the title New Britain, Connecticut, represents industrial cities of the time. Now, New Britain went on to be surnamed the hardware capital of the world because of all of the production of hardware and actually small metal and countertop hardware equipment and a very robust industrial base that probably continued through the 1960s. But this is the 1860s. And so we're just seeing the harbingers of the Industrial Revolution. If you look at the postcard in the upper right, drawn from the park, you see one smokestack that is protruding from this otherwise flat factory roof. So we don't know exactly what it is, but looking out to the north part of the city, which where a lot of the factories at that point were then established because of the open space outside the city. So look at this map on the left. What you see is these two vignettes on the lower bottom, I should say, on the bottom of the card. And what they do is showcase the size, really, the symmetry and the pride in these large industrial plants that were brought to bring jobs above all, but were thought to bring progress, obviously, to this city of New Britain, Connecticut, which is a little bit to the southwest of Hartford, where you are. What you will see in the map, and this is interesting, at about this time, doctors in the 19th century began to prescribe walks in the park because even the medical profession, even in the 1860s, believed that time in nature promoted faster recuperation. So the buildings on the lower right, which are the original buildings of the New Britain General Hospital, would be found, I hope you can see my pointer here, right to the southeast corner of this map, right above this factory vignette, and that would be across from the park. So the park was commissioned by early industrialists of the time, including the Stanley family that produced Stanley tools. And so look at the topography of this. There is a water basin at the very top, which is still a reflecting pool. And then it drains down to what would be the lowlands of the city, to this canal, which doesn't exist anymore. But what you have is the train tracks. And as we know from really topographic mapping, that the trains and some highways were always woven to what was the lowest and flattest part of any type of terrain because it cost less and they did not have to didn't have to blast to get through anywhere. So what we have is naturally just looking at this map, we have the topography suggesting how well Olmsted understood the question of sanitation and the connection between public health, the idea of engineering emphasis, so really environmental engineering that would promote good drainage, and the idea of drainage, sanitation, locations of sanitary facilities reflected nascent knowledge of the connection between water pollution and disease spread of that time. So Olmsted believed the landscape was not just beautiful, it was essential. Parks and open space allowed beleaguered city dwellers to be restored. And so think of who would be part of those beleaguered city dwellers. They would be the new industrial workers. They would be rural farmers that had come and be newly urbanized to take some of these jobs. There were immigrants coming from overseas. They were newly emancipated slaves in the 1860s who moved north during the first migration. So he believed these beleaguered city dwellers that did not have the private grounds, did not have private green space, would have an opportunity to be restored so that, and these are his words, they might devote themselves to the welfare of others. Parks offered spaces which fostered mental and physical health, but in doing so, helped to develop a web of intersocietal connections that makes community and community nexus possible. These parks were essential, said Olmsted. Parks are the most valuable of all possible forms of public spaces. So think about this, when we have gated communities, et cetera, Olmsted in the 1860s, 70s understood that parks were the canvas by which people of all societal sectors and strata encountered one another. So this postcard from 1900 shows the Golf House in Franklin Park, these nattily dressed gentlemen out with their walking canes and bow ties and other coattails. We have 100 years later, the same park. We have Franklin Park, 527 acres, straddling Boston's communities of Roxbury, Jamaica Plain, and Dorchester. These are all neighborhoods and communities that continue to attract people of different races, ethnicities, communities. So it becomes an all accessible. This place can be reimagined as an inclusive and accessible country park in the city. So this is one design, especially looking to make this universally accessible for people of physical disabilities. And so this was a design competition award winner. But it's so beautiful to see how the bones really of Olmsted's park from the latter part of the last really 2 centuries ago can be reimagined in the 21st century and make it equally relevant to park dwellers. So Olmsted, and this is a quote from the New Yorker from 2010, the writer saying, Olmsted was a big fan of democracy, doing big things for everyone, including future generations. So think about the language that goes into planning climate change, and we need to protect the planet for future generations. Whether scenic beauty or war, hospital or park, Olmsted believed that we were all in this together, like it or not. So think about what we have just been through as really not only a country, really a community, a country, a planet. We've gone through and are not out of the dark yet, COVID-19, but we do know that time in nature was linked and continues to be linked to subjective well-being under circumstances of pandemic lockdown. I'm going to show you that this is this Hopper-esque scene of an office worker, but we know that for many of us, a return to, say, urban workspaces, home offices, particularly in urban apartment buildings, look very similar to this with no views of nature. Those that were able to have flex schedules or work from home snuck out when they could, perhaps in suburban locations where they were able to, for middle of the day breaks to restore their sort of mental and psychological taxation that this pandemic was causing. We also know that higher level green space, as measured by satellite imaging, led to a 6% lower level of COVID. Well, we know there's many cofactors in that. But we do know in areas with high percentages of Black residents, so that controls for all many other sociodemographic factors, higher green space, with all other factors being similar, correlated to lower levels of mortality. So again, we look at the Hudson River Hospital and we see how Olmsted imagines some blend of the vignette on the left and the scene, the photo on the right, to incorporate both spaces for treatment indoors and out. This is some of my own research that I did during the pandemic. And so we looked at subjective perceptions of nature deprivation. We weren't looking by race, but it was one of the factors that we considered. We do have to say we looked at nature deprivation rather than just resilience in nature. And we know that was higher from almost hundreds of studies performed on this, because many people rely on being in nature for their emotional well-being. So to take away something that is beneficial and people rely on itself caused a lack of, I should say, associated with a lack of flourishing. When we start to break down our responses into self-perceived nature deprivation, and it was just not a one-off question, we looked at what the components of nature deprivation were. So places where parks were closed, or limited in terms of access, car access or foot access, degrees of lockdown within cities, views from windows, prior habits of physical activity before and during the pandemic outdoors. So this is what we found. Among non-Hispanic whites, so this would be everybody but whites, I should say whites, everybody who is not, right? Everybody who is white, not white. So we had half of all of our respondents admitted to feeling nature deprived or strongly nature deprived. Now, for statistical power, we grouped all the non-white participants in the survey study. So we had about 700 people responded, and nearly 2/3 of non-whites felt nature deprived. So many reasons for this. The nature deprivation in turn led to a second stage of modeling, which showed a loss of flourishing and well-being of perhaps between 6 and 7%, which actually factored to the equivalent of losing wages from the COVID pandemic. So how does this actually occur? These are domains of pathways that link green space to positive health outcomes. We're thinking most of the studies come out of positively associate exposure to green space to health and well-being. So if we look at green space, there's 3 predominant pathways by which health is mediated, or I should say mediators of green space lead us to health and well-being, better said. So the first one of these is harm mitigation. You can think of shade brings down heat, for example. I have a couple slides to follow on that. It reduces air pollution because of the filtration of the foliage, and particularly fall foliage rather than spring foliage is something that does this. Noise, it's a noise buffer. Okay, so we can see this. Let's just take noise. Okay, noise contributes to interrupted sleep. Interrupted sleep contributes to higher levels of cardiovascular illness, depression, because of that lack of continuity. So green space as a noise buffer or a mitigator would pass through harm mitigation to create more positive health and well-being outcomes. The middle one is particularly interesting because we have a lot of research that shows green space and exposure to nature is able to provoke really 2 sort of theoretical outcomes. One is attention restoration theory. The second is stress recovery theory. And these were piloted really at the end of, I should say, end of 70s, 80s by environmental psychologists Stephen and Rachel Kaplan from the University of Michigan, and continue to influence a whole body of thought in the nature mental health sphere. We have the third thing is the instauration capacities, which is probably a new word for you, but we know that green space is a mediator for physical activity. We call that green exercise, the idea of social cohesion. You often go outdoors, you run, you jog, you walk with friends, maybe during your lunchtime. So this becomes its own. Being with people improves your well-being, doing physical activity improves your health. Doing each of these in green space is like, the triple. If you were to walk with friends in nature, jog with friends in nature, it's like the hat trick, of hockey that would lead to incremental and cumulative bonuses for health and well-being. So Olmsted, again, I'll go back to a quote from him. He says this indirect attention that one puts onto nature, because it's a soft focus rather than the hard focus of looking at your computers or doing problem sets, what you're going to have is that soft focus is in itself a cause for attention restoration. So he says it will seem probable that the mind receives impressions, information, and suggestions in an unconscious way, so that in nature, the mind is fed, refreshed, revived, and restocked by what it receives, all unconscious in the process. I'm going to take you to the built environment, because much of the work that we do here at the School of Public Health in environmental assessment looks at the built environment as, for the most part, a negative influence on health. At the same time, we're looking to see, are there ways, if the built environment cannot be a positive influence on health, at least it's benign in terms of health. So this is just representative, not only how we live, work, and commute, but boy, if these aren't patterns of living, working, and commuting, I don't know what is. The mechanisms through which health outcomes are affected by the built environment are many. So all of this, there's sense of community, social capital, just picking random ones out of here, physical disorder. So something that is like they say the broken window syndrome, to look, and if you see physical disorder in your neighborhood, it provokes a sense of neglect, a sense that who I am in my neighborhood does not matter. So as we just gave a reference to sleep, but also chronic diseases, all of these things that are almost imperceptible and occurring at a subconscious level, we are associated with higher levels of cardiovascular disease, inflammatory diseases like obesity, diabetes. Walkability in your community is the same issue. So infectious disease is one part of it, obviously the density of where you're built, or we would see that in terms of COVID, but aging and equity, those are now also within the domain of environmental justice and are issues very germane to our work here in environmental assessment. I'm going to give you an example of heat and income and its relationship. This is a wonderful, really interactive set of graphing that was in the New York Times, I believe in August. I can give you the link, but this was modeled also with USGS data, land use data. So let's just take the city of Louisville, Kentucky, which is actually a very old and beautiful city, and has no less than seven green space, large parks that were designed by Olmsted. So I think this is a good example here. Our census tracts in Louisville display a moderate correlation between heat and income. So what does that mean? Let's start, if we look at this green map on the right, you might think this is green space, but to be perfectly frank, those areas of higher income, which could be pictured a residential area, like the upper right, or the areas that border large public parks, are often those areas in which residents of higher income live and settle. So higher level of income on this map at the right pairs with lower surface temperatures. So the paler, the pink peach color here on the left, corresponding to the darker green segments of the Louisville maps. And so we see, again, where there's no or lower levels of income, we can presume in much public housing or Section 8 housing that there's not the same investment either of street trees or mature landscaping or even decorative landscaping around the houses. So with the absence of foliage, in the absence of shade, we are indeed going to have higher surface temperatures. why would higher surface temperatures matter to residents? Well, this is a map or profile on the bottom of an urban heat island that would run you from the exurbs or rural areas going across suburban residential communities to increasing areas of urban densification, such as the commercial rings around a downtown center. And look at how urban heat that is captured as radiated heat or heat radiated back from dense concrete pavement with very little green space rises here in 7 degrees. But on average, this could go from between 4 and 10 degrees Fahrenheit in the atmosphere directly over downtown areas than in any of these concentric circles that go to the exurban areas. So the ability to wisely invest by cities, by landscape architects, urban planners who are recruited to help plan, lay out, and mitigate heat. As we know, urban heat is becoming connected with higher temperatures resulting from climate change, from global warming. Any kind of use of urban ecology, biophilic interventions, biophilia, the love of living things, or even we call urban acupuncture. Take what would normally be a flat, concrete-driven plaza with some benches, but the introduction of shade, the introduction perhaps of an artificial water feature here, of bushes, of a green wall. This is something that can considerably reduce the temperature, even by the evapotranspiration of these trees here, as well as the direct shading. So to bring down those heat and make that area, the sort of the micro temperature, the microclimate created around those urban interventions, those biophilic interventions, it can make it physiologically tolerable for residents there. And then you'll see less incidence of heat stroke, for example, of other types of ischemic heart disease incidences. But more importantly, this is also connected to our emergency personnel in the cities. They have to respond to more fires. They have to respond to more violent incidences, they're called on, because heat, obviously heat is connected to fire, but heat actually drives violence, believe it or not, in cities, just because of the mental strain on people. I don't know if you recognize either of these names, Dr. Sam Myers and Dr. Howard Frumkin. They're really giants in the field here. I had the pleasure of listening to both of them in talks within the last month. And so there's a recent volume called Planetary Health, I think by Island Press, Protecting Nature to Protect Ourselves. Similarly, this tome on the right, Braiding Sweetgrass, is one of indigenous wisdoms and scientific knowledge. Dr. Myers said specifically, I just really was taken by what he said. He believes that we have fundamentally broken with our spiritual and emotional relationship to nature, that faith traditions have been marginalized in our secular society, including indigenous knowledge and spiritual practices. So it's not hard to recognize indigenous practices, and also many animist spiritual traditions turned to nature, felt at one with nature, did not discard or destroy nature, but used it to one's benefit without taking advantage or feeling superior to it. So it was a very symbiotic relationship with nature. So faith traditions really raised up a reverence for the natural world, which was both seamless within the broader framework of belief, humility, and I'm going to emphasize that, and gratitude for having the gifts of nature by which they survived and could thrive as communities. So nature health researchers, especially in the sphere of emotional and mental health, have begun investigating the phenomena of awe and wonder as things that are uniquely coming out of a nature engagement experience, as if this were generally absent and perhaps forgotten about from our increasingly secular experience. I think these ancient wisdom traditions, if I might say, which certainly understood qualities of reverence, mutuality with nature, and ecological humility, would find this sadly telling that we need to do research on wonder and awe. Think about that when we stand before a natural landscape. It should be part and parcel, but obviously it's not. I will take this further. I wonder among those of you who are listening and those that will listen, how many of you actually read this headline? that Pope Francis joins the world faith leaders in urgent climate appeal ahead of COP26. So, you know, COP26 is the meeting that will be the climate change summit that will be in Glasgow, Scotland at the beginning of next month. And so this was a gathering actually called Faith and Science Toward COP26, which was a ceremony at the Vatican. Again, I had to really look to find in a marginal journal, put it that way. But of note that all the religious leaders, or over 40 that gathered here. And so in response to the grave threats of climate change, the heads of the world's major religions united at the Vatican to issue an unprecedented joint appeal to government leaders for next month's UN Climate Summit. There were figures led by Pope Francis, but Islamic, Jewish, Buddhist, Hindu leaders. I would imagine that overall they provide spiritual leadership to maybe 5 billion of the world's 7 billion population. So they urge governments to, I quote, achieve net zero carbon emissions as soon as possible, unquote. They also pledged to increase awareness of the climate crises and actions within their own congregations. But they didn't just stop with the fossil fuel and carbon emissions. Their statement calls for special attention to the rights of Indigenous peoples, those that have rights to continue to thrive in nature and depend on natural communities that we are using for resource consumption, an end to biodiversity loss, responsible financing by banks and investors, and including green banks for renewable energy, and a just transition to a clean energy economy, with particular attention to retraining and employing people currently working the fossil fuel industry. How much more specific a pathway forward do we need to hear? But again, how many of you even read about this? So calling climate change a moral issue really stresses the education and crucial role of religious traditions that we need for this ecological conversion. Now, Laudato Si is the one platform that I am most familiar with, which was a papal encyclical issued before the last climate gathering. But again, since the world didn't move to the exhortations of Pope Francis the last time, the Laudato Si has been put into an action platform. So this is a 5 to 7 year platform going forward. But just consider, response to the cry of the earth, the cry of the poor, ecological economics, and it goes through education, sustainable life size at the left, and participatory engagement. I would dare say, with its focus on the poor community engagement and the imbalanced distribution, not only of resource consumption, but of the imbalanced distribution of the harms of global warming, such as sea level rise, this might be the most ignored and undervalued environmental justice document of our time. So returning to this roadmap, let's go to the nature-human health relationship that brings us to the Olmsted and Brain lecture that I'm privileged to be a part of. I want to say that nature has been scientifically linked to greater attentiveness, creative processes, executive functioning, changes in personality, actually. People are more philanthropic, generous, social, empathetic to the pains and problems of others, and have higher self-esteem and lower levels of anxiety when they are exposed to nature in intervention type studies. Similarly, this goes for children. And this is where it's most important, because if we don't expose children to levels that many of you might have grown up in suburban areas, but with increased urbanization of generations, or I should say grandparents, extended relatives who may have lived in rural communities, that linkage between playing outside unsupervised in a special part of nature, maybe a little brook, a little patch of forest, that created this sense of place attachment and nature affinity. We're losing all this. So children who have been exposed to nature show levels of lower impulsivity. They concentrate better in school-like or attention settings. They're more imaginative in their play. They play more cooperatively with their peers. They display lower levels of depression, don't get distressed as easily psychologically. And we've actually seen that with some of the nature schools under COVID. Students, and whether for preschoolers, elementary, all the way through high school, who have been part of nature schools have been able to cope much easier. They're not provoked. They have fewer bursts of crying or just a sense of self-control. But if we go all the way down, this greater nature affiliation, and that's what we Also, going forward to future generations, we risk losing. Again, here's some of my research I was privileged to be a part of. So we did narrative review of time spent in nature, especially among children, is associated with increased pro-environmental attitudes and behaviors. So what does this actually mean? What this means is that the body of research, the body of research has showed that associations between children's exposure to nature and various emotional and cognitive outcomes that we just saw help to develop pro-environmental attitudes and behaviors. So they're more likely to connect with the nature emotionally and therefore care for it. And emotional pro-environmental attitudes and behaviors could be something like, as they grow older, or they might participate even in children recycling programs, in awareness and care for climate change, of concern for loss of species. Overall, time spent in nature, regardless of the quality of the environmental conditions. So even in really some poor neighborhoods in cities like Houston, for example, this leads to a higher perceived value that children ascribe to nature. And this goes across race, ethnicity. It actually goes across income levels as well. But the availability of access to nature, we know it's important, but yet some patches are so small, so rare, and so not cared for, so disregarded, that it's insufficient to encourage its use. Or if you know, for example, there's high air pollution proximate to poor neighborhoods, to power plants, for example, or manufacturing, parents are not going to encourage their kids to go outside knowing that the air is contaminated. So this is not either going to encourage this role of pro-nature, embracing and caring for nature into future generations. And that includes climate change legislation and action. So Dr. Mary Mahoney, who was the first speaker in this lecture series, said that the challenge is legitimizing nature as a therapeutic intervention. There are many studies out there, right? And you often find that doctors are more willing to prescribe nature rather than type of drugs, ADHD medication, for one, if they can point to what they call recognizable, quantifiable studies. And so the challenge to researchers like myself and my peers is to subject the practices of nature intervention to the rigors of science methodology is an ongoing issue. So if we were to come up with a study that seeks to analyze some of the effects of nature exposure, let's think about this. How would you dream something like this up? Let's find what our outcome could be. Okay, what about if we look at changes in mood, cognitive attention? So again, executive functioning, better attention restoration, that could come with being exposed to nature. Would that be feasible? And how might we design a study like that? Okay, let's think about it. Let's plan this study out. And this is what people like myself do. All right, we are going to have an exposure, which will be nature of some form. Okay, so your time in nature, doesn't matter if you're out gardening, if you're taking a walk in the woods, if you're planning on that beautiful, that walk that Olmsted designed for you all right in front of Trinity's campus. Our outcome is going to be cognitive attention, mood, because there's always psychometric studies already, that validated questionnaires and others to measure these things. We could do sleep quality, time in nature, not just the activity, but it does itself give you a sense of restoration that allows you to sleep better. And how are we going to measure this? Well, there's a lot of new smartphone deployable apps. There's a lot of mobile technology, we know, odometers, whatever, but we're trying to capture what your mood, what your attention could be in the moment that you're in nature. And we can actually do this on smartphones right now. And what might be our study window for this? Well, here's where we are, October, November, December. Let's give this 3 months of capturing data. What scientific questions would we try to answer in a study like this? And why would it matter, of course? So how will different lengths of time in nature influence changes in mood and attention? So if a doctor were to prescribe a nature intervention rather than a prescription drug, how much time would be necessary to send a patient out into nature? Half an hour, how many times a week? So will the amount of time influence these outcomes? How do age, race, ethnicity, gender, region you live in the country, any of those things, Are they groupable by, are they observable on an individual basis, or do they group by the subgroup to which you belong? Are some things like your gender, does that mediate a different response? Does the idea of habituation, so is this a new experience for you, or are you accustomed to nature? So sometimes I think of this as your first cigarette, your first kiss, there's something novel that also elicits a site of arousal and excitement that might play a role in the outcome. And then finally, this nature level in your home environment was something that we saw under COVID. So again, where you're going to be in urban nature is where you come from, in where you go back to your residential address. Is the difference between, say, your study environment, your work environment, your recreation environment. How different is that from your home environment? I think these are all things that would be legitimate hypotheses for study. Well, I actually like the study design, and guess what? Something like this does exist, and you can participate. So this is a study that we have recently launched, and with Dr. Massino's cooperation, we're presenting it to you all to join in. I have 2 QR codes. One is, it's a 10-minute survey that'll ask you some general questions, but it's going to specifically have, it's going to have a mood questionnaire, that multidimensional mood questionnaire, and that's going to have 2 batteries of cognitive tests that will measure not just the accuracy of your responses, but how long it takes you to respond. And then we would invite you to do time in outdoor nature. So whether you're sitting on a park bench in a beautiful LA and downtown Hartford, whether you're taking a walk, a hike, whether you're, it depends, I'm not saying go out in weather, but pick a nice day. We're still in fall, we're still in beautiful foliage. Go out and take a walk around. I believe you have some field trips scheduled with this class. So anywhere from record the amount of time you were out there. And then you're going to come back and we have a QR code for post-nature survey. And the data that's collected is totally removed any type of personal, it's de-identified, so any kind of personal markers are removed from this. All we would know is the data itself, and it will help us in the aggregate to find ever more precise and granular measures and benefits of the connection between nature and health. So I'm going to close with really 6 principles derived from Frederick Law Olmsted's teaching and his belief of why I feel in this moment of natural, I think many of us feel this way, this national malaise, that we have fractured dialogue in our country and maybe beyond to the world. We've seen it with COVID, we've seen it in politics. Why nature could be a national healer. They both come from the same word. But think about this, politically, we have a left side, we have a right side, but we're united when we go outside. And this is a slogan it's put out by the REI Co-op, and in full transparency, REI has been generous enough to sponsor a lot of my research. So across the past couple of years, and I've been able to talk to people in many sectors, many regions, many economic strata, and it's been really rewarding for me to find out where people's attitudes and relationship with nature is born, to go back to that word. Number 1, I want to say nature is a healer. Nature is often best experienced collectively. How many of you have had the experience before standing really on a coastline or along a lake or anywhere where the horizon is visible and watching a magnificent sunset? And everybody, then, these are strangers. I mean, we're always with strangers. There's people that gather simply to see the spectacle of nature. We end with clapping, just a robust clapping of hands. Everybody is enriched by that. It's a communal experience with complete strangers. You know nothing about their politics or how they feel, but it's often best experienced collectively rather than all alone. Number 2, nature's healer. There's no fake news, just objective facts. Everything is pretty down to the 0.1 mile here. But more importantly, if you were to ask somebody, how far is the summit? They're going to give you, they're not going to mislead you. They're going to give you a correct answer. It's not far. It's only, I'd say a quarter mile. And more than that, they're going to encourage you to get there. They're not going to discourage you or argue with you. Nature's number 3. Who's run out of food on a trail, particularly if it's an overnight trail, or a long trail? It's hard to plan precisely 3 meals a day and all your snacks when you're consuming a lot of calories over the course of a week. Total strangers will say, listen, I've got some extra food, you take it. No, you'll need it. No, I'm okay, please, I insist. Nature truly inspires our own best selves. Nature's number 4, okay? Many people I spoke with who otherwise might feel uncomfortable in other areas, maybe people were shy or had inhibitions or anxieties, they say, I like going out to nature because nature doesn't judge me. Nature holds up no mirrors. So unless, of course, you're Narcissus, who you probably remember, if you remember your Greek myths, Echo and Narcissus. This painting by Waterhouse shows that. Narcissus was so enraptured by his own image reflected from a local water pool that he then missed Echo, really his love, and he just continued to admire himself. But unlike Narcissus, nature holds up no mirrors. We could truly be ourselves. Nature number 5, you have to trust your innate intuition when you go out in nature. You're not going to have guidebooks. You may have guidebooks, you may have trail guides, but listen, things happen. And so you need to trust yourself. You don't need to then put your finger up to the wind constantly and see what other people are telling you to do. And nor do you need algorithms to tell you how you've viewed yourself and how you have to keep doing the same thing. Finally, nature number 6. Anybody's had this experience, nature inspires awe. It reacquaints us, and I say that, with our true place in the world, okay? That together, with all of our iPads, iPhones we've kind of lost our perspective with where we stand in the world. So let's put this into perspective. Put this into a biomass perspective, in fact. This is shared from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences from a few years ago. There's roughly 545 gigatons of carbon represented on our planet. More than 80% of that is made up of plants. See this little corner here, animals. Humans pertain to animals, this little corner of 2 gigatons of carbon. And if we break out those 2 gigatons of carbon, humans make up 0.06 of gigatons. So basically, the carbon weight of humans in terms of our entire planet are 1/10,000% of global biomass. Actually, livestock outweighs us, like mollusks, like clams and snails outweigh us by a factor of 3.5 to 1, as compared to our annual carbon footprint. So again, here is that 82.5%, and God knows if mollusks put out a lot of carbon. But anyway, so they're sinking or collecting, sequestering carbon, whereas our 1/10,000% is issuing this amount of global carbon emissions. I know you know all this, but that is pretty presumptuous when we start to weigh the numbers one against the other. And no less than Michael J. Fox. He said anthropocentrism really put humans at the center of the universe, regarding humankind as the very center and pinnacle of existence. It's a disease of arrested development. Great show. Okay, so to conclude here, Olmsted believed that healthy civil societies bring people together. What else did he say about this? And how do we make this really relevant to today? So Olmsted was a social as well as a public health and landscape reformer. To look at his designs, what you see is not just designs for parks that he believed were the lungs of the world, really the lungs of a city. But look at this park. I mean, this is a Prospect Park in Brooklyn. If this doesn't look like a circulatory system of pathways, of veins and interstices, places of flow, these are not places of blockage. These are not places where dialogue and thought is blocked. These are places of flow. They go and they meander within forested areas, and they have open places for restoration and long views of things. These were intentionally created, these paths and points of flow and intersection, so that people of all strata of society, yes, the educated classes that really hired the industrialists and the educated classes that paid for the design and the installation of these parks. But as we said, the industrial workers, the Blacks that were from the South, immigrants, newly urbanized farmers, they would encounter each other intentionally and greet each other along these paths at the points of intersection. So Olmsted believed above all that healthy civil societies bring people together. His prescriptions for this time, mid-1800s, of democratic spaces, communities, healthy connections to natural and sustainable landscapes were as vital then and even more vital today to address questions of racism, inequality, including inequitable access to nature. It's one of the things I'm looking at, and really our urgent problem of climate change. So I want to thank you for listening to me. For my remarks today, I would love to hear your feedback and take your questions. You can email me on the nature study. And I would say we need somebody just like Mr. Olmsted for Senate, or at least politics, any body politic right now, who has the same wide-eyed civic principles behind his work. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you so much, Linda. That was phenomenal. Yeah, I agree. The more I learn about Olmsted, the more visionary I realized he was in terms of understanding the little details as well as the big picture. We're getting to the end of our time, but I want to quickly ask if anyone has a quick question, please feel free to unmute and participate.
And I apologize for going over. I think, when one practices, you speak a little quicker to make the time, but the
pacing was perfect. I just want to mention one thing that really struck me. What we're often talking about in this class is sort of a back to the future theme of how we knew all this, how we, need to relearn it in so many different ways. And one of the points that you made is that he suggested spending an hour or two in nature. And I don't know if you're aware of that recent study in the UK, which had over 20,000 participants talking about 2 hours in nature a week, which could be broken up into different chunks of time, was really what you needed. It's like, he already figured that out way back then. He said, an hour or two,
You are so right.
Yeah. So, I'm just constantly struck by keep on picking up these little things from the historical. So one thing I just wanted to ask about your study, because I don't remember this, are you recording what kind of nature people are in?
Yes, as a matter of fact. So I'm going to just put up that, let me see, I'm just going to put it back up and go to this. Okay, so I posted this here. Yes, one of the questions in the post-nature survey is going to be what type of nature you were in and also how long you spent in there. And then also if you were in nature within the last 3 days, because that would make a difference. If you're doing something you do every day and it's habitual, this is one of the questions we were asking. And it will look a lot different if this is a sporadic or once a month time in nature. So if anybody, you can actually capture these QRs right on your phone, but Dr. Massino will also have this.
Yeah, yes, thank you. Because as you know, I've been trying to look at what are the different co-benefits that we could have for climate, for biodiversity, and for health. So you know that a turf lawn may be a nice place to sit in nature, but it's not doing the same job in terms of the climate and biodiversity as a woodland is, or a intact riparian corridor along a river, or any of these other critical habitats that we need to connect and protect our biodiversity, which is really our lifeline. So I'm hoping that some of these, spend time in nature studies start to become more specific so that we can develop more specific policies that can have these co-benefits. So that's, as you know, that's one of my missions. So thank you for doing this work.
Thank you. So really, we hope as many of you possible will join in this study. It helps us to learn. And so again, we call it citizen science, but it is an opportunity to be part of a scientific study. So as Dr. Massino does, so perhaps it's a career you may consider going forward yourselves.
Yes, thank you. Well, we'll be in touch. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. This recording will be available on the Olmsted 200 and also at Trinity College. And I hope that you will share it and join us for our subsequent talks on November 18th and December 2nd. Thank you again.
Thank you.